And Emily has so graciously offered her little cottage for your pre-wedding getaway, Liam. Isn't she just the sweetest?" The words, spoken by my mother, sliced through the restaurant's polite hum and landed on our table with the force of a dropped plate. I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. A piece of roasted asparagus, perfectly crisp, suddenly seemed impossible to eat. Around me, the soft clinking of silverware and the murmur of other diners faded into a dull roar in my ears. I hadn't offered anything. I hadn't even been asked. My mother, Helen, beamed at my sister's fiancé, her smile a masterclass in social grace. Liam, a kind man who knew nothing of our family's treacherous currents, smiled back. "Wow, Emily, that's incredibly generous. We'd love that." I felt their eyes turn to me, 3 pairs of them, expectant. Chloe, my beautiful, radiant sister, reached across the table and placed her hand on mine. Her skin was soft, her touch light as a feather, but it felt like a shackle. "Oh, Mummy, don't just volunteer her like that," Chloe said, her voice a confection of sweet reproach. "We have to ask properly." She squeezed my hand, her blue eyes wide and pleading. "Emily, would that be okay? We desperately need a little getaway before the real madness begins. Your cottage is just so perfect and romantic." The question was a performance, a box to be ticked. The decision had already been made and announced on my behalf. My role was simply to agree with a smile, to play the part of the endlessly accommodating older sister. To say no would be to cause a scene, to be difficult, to ruin the perfect picture of family harmony my mother was painting for Liam. I swallowed, my throat tight. "Chloe, I don't know," I started, my voice quieter than I intended. "It's just, the heirloom roses are in a very delicate phase right now. They need a specific watering schedule, and the new seedlings—" My mother set her wineglass down with a sharp click. The sound was a warning shot. "Emily," she said, her smile vanishing, replaced by the hard, familiar edge of disappointment. "Don't be so selfish." The words, though whispered, echoed in the sudden silence. Selfish. It was the label they had pinned on me my entire life, anytime my needs dared to exist. Liam shifted uncomfortably, his gaze dropping to his plate, as he sensed he'd walked into a minefield. "Your sister's happiness is the most important thing right now," my mother continued, her voice low and piercing. "She is getting married. She needs this. And you're worried about a few plants? You're always so wrapped up in your work, in all that dirt." The insult, so casual and dismissive, found its usual mark. The dirt, the very soil I had used to build a life, a career, something real and lasting, was reduced to a dirty inconvenience. I looked at Chloe. She was staring at her perfectly manicured nails, a practiced pout on her lips, the very picture of a wronged heroine. I was trapped, hemmed in by a fabricated offer, an emotional appeal, and a public shaming. It was a perfectly executed maneuver, one they had deployed countless times before. My quiet protest was futile. My world was meant to shrink, to make room for hers. "Of course," I heard myself say, the words tasting like ash. "You can have the cottage." Instantly, the tension vanished. My mother's smile returned, triumphant. "There, see, Chloe, your sister just needed a little reminder of what's important." She patted my hand, her touch cold and dismissive. "That's my good girl." As Chloe and my mother launched back into a cheerful discussion about wedding favors, I looked down at my plate, my appetite gone. The knot in my stomach had hardened into a cold, heavy stone. I had just been forced to give away the keys to my sanctuary, a place built from my own sweat and my father's memory, and as I sat there in my silk blouse, feeling like a weed in their pristine garden, I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that this was more than just a mistake. It was a violation. Sleep didn't come. Back in my apartment, the city lights painted sterile patterns on the ceiling, a cold and distant beauty that offered no comfort. All I could feel was the hollow ache in my chest, a familiar guest after any encounter with my family. I tossed and turned, the crisp, clean sheets feeling like sandpaper against my skin. The silence of the room was too loud. It made space for the memories to rush in. I closed my eyes and I wasn't in my high-rise apartment anymore. I was 16, and the air smelled of damp earth and possibility. It was the first summer after we'd bought the cottage, before the renovations, before the landscaping, when it was just a little house with a big, unruly heart. The memory was so clear I could feel the sun on my shoulders and the satisfying ache in my muscles. My father was there. He was on his knees on the packed dirt that would become the patio, his brow furrowed in concentration as he showed me how to mix the mortar. His hands, usually clean from his work as an accountant, were calloused and gray with dust. "See, Emily," he'd said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "Not too wet, not too dry. It's like baking a cake. You have to feel it." I'd plunged my own hands into the wheelbarrow, mimicking his movements, feeling the grit and the coolness of the mixture. We spent the entire weekend like that, a two-person team under the summer sun. We'd lift the heavy, irregular flagstones, turning them over and over until they fit together just right, like pieces of a giant earthen puzzle. He taught me about patience, about how the strongest foundations are built slowly, with intention. I can still see Chloe, sprawled on a lawn chair just beyond the mess, her face illuminated by the blue glow of her phone. She'd sigh dramatically every 20 minutes or so. "Are you guys almost done? It's so boring out here." My dad would just chuckle and wipe the sweat from his forehead with the back of his arm. "We're not done, sweetheart. We're building something." Chloe never understood. To her, it was just dirty work. To my father and me, it was creation. Every stone we laid was a promise. Every drop of sweat was an investment. That patio wasn't just a floor of rock, it was a testament. It was weekends of shared laughter, of learning, of a father showing his daughter that she was strong and capable. On the last day, as we stood back to admire our work, the setting sun casting long shadows across the uneven, perfect surface, my dad had slung a heavy arm around my shoulders. He smelled of sweat and cement and sunshine. "Look at that, Em," he'd whispered, a deep pride in his voice. He wasn't looking at the patio, he was looking at me. "What you build with your own hands, sweetheart, no one can ever take away from you." Lying in my bed, the city humming its indifferent song outside my window, his words echoed back to me, not as a comfort, but as a cruel, painful joke. I had built that place. I had poured my heart into its soil, and I had just let them take it. The memory of my father's words faded, replaced by a colder, more recent bitterness that coiled in my gut. It wasn't just about the cottage. It was never just about one thing. It was about the pattern. A lifetime of being the steady, reliable bedrock that my sister Chloe could chip away at whenever she pleased. My mind drifted back a year to a frantic phone call on a Tuesday afternoon. Chloe was in tears, a fabricated, breathless kind of panic she deployed for maximum effect. She'd maxed out a credit card, again, and the payment was due. It was $2,000. Not a life-shattering sum, but not insignificant either. It was the fee for 2 weeks of intensive landscape design seminars I'd been saving up for. I remember sighing, the familiar weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders. I gave her the lecture I always gave, about budgeting, about living within her means. And as always, I transferred the money, because that's what I did. I was the fixer, the safety net. Less than a week later, a picture appeared on my social media feed. It was Chloe posing in front of a chic downtown bistro, smiling dazzlingly at the camera. On her arm was a brand new designer handbag, a swath of gleaming leather and polished gold hardware that I knew for a fact cost at least half of the money I had just given her. When I called her, my voice tight with a fury I could barely contain, she was genuinely baffled by my anger. Her response was so perfectly, maddeningly Chloe. "Well, I could only afford it because you paid off my debt," she'd said, as if explaining simple math to a child. "So I had all this extra money saved. You should be happy for me." I was speechless. When I tried to explain the concept of responsibility to my mother later that day, hoping for an ally, her response was swift and dismissive. "Oh, Emily, let her be. She's young. She deserves to have some fun." She deserves. That was the philosophy of Chloe's entire life. She deserved the fun, the bags, the bailouts, and I deserved to pay for it. Lying there in the dark, the memory was so vivid it made my teeth ache. I had paid her debt so she could buy a luxury, and now I was giving her my house, the house my father and I built, so she could have a romantic weekend. The pattern was a cage, and for my entire life, I had been willingly walking into it. The weekend had been an exercise in forced distraction. I'd thrown myself into a complex topographical survey, losing myself in the familiar comfort of contour lines and drainage calculations. But the work felt hollow. Every so often, the image of my mother's condescending smile or Chloe's feigned innocence would flash in my mind, leaving a sour taste. I kept telling myself it was just a weekend. They would be gone by Sunday evening, and I could go back, reset my space, and breathe again. It was late Sunday afternoon when my phone buzzed on the drafting table, a sharp, intrusive sound in the quiet of my apartment. I glanced at the screen, a notification from the security app I'd installed at the cottage. Motion detected at front door. My first thought was relief. They were leaving. I imagined Chloe, probably complaining about having to tidy up, dragging her suitcase down the porch steps. I tapped the notification, the live feed flickering to life on my screen, but they weren't leaving. The front door was wide open, and the porch looked like the aftermath of a frat party. Red plastic cups were scattered across the floor, some overturned in sticky puddles. A string of what looked like party lights was haphazardly draped over the railing. My stomach clenched. A quiet, romantic getaway for two. That was the promise. My thumb, suddenly clumsy, swiped to the recorded events from the past 24 hours. The screen populated with a timeline of video clips from Saturday night, dozens of them. I tapped on one from around 10 p.m. The image that loaded stole the air from my lungs. My quiet, peaceful cottage was overrun. There weren't two people. There were at least 20. Strangers. They were everywhere, spilling out onto the lawn, crowding the porch, their faces illuminated by the flashing of their phones. The camera's microphone picked up a distorted thumping bass and the high-pitched shrieks of laughter. It wasn't a getaway. It was a rager. I felt a hot surge of anger, a violation so profound it made my hands shake. I scrolled furiously through the clips, my breath catching with each new piece of evidence. Then I saw it, a clip from just after midnight, time-stamped 12:17 a.m. The camera angle perfectly covered the stone patio, my patio. A small group was clustered around a portable barbecue grill, the kind you take tailgating. It was perched precariously near the edge of the stonework. As I watched, a young man with a backward baseball cap stumbled, grabbing onto the grill to steady himself. The entire thing tipped over. A shower of glowing orange coals cascaded directly onto the large gray flagstone in the center, the one my father had called the cornerstone. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart pounding against my ribs. I saw the stones glow red for a moment, then the sickening spidery crack that spread across the surface as the intense heat met the cold night air. A dark, ugly scorch mark bloomed like a wound. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was Chloe and Liam, standing just a few feet away. I saw them turn at the commotion. I saw them look directly at the spilled coals, at the ruined stone my father and I had set with our own hands. Liam winced for a second, but Chloe just laughed. It was a careless, dismissive sound. She nudged Liam, said something I couldn't hear, and they turned their backs on the damage, disappearing back into the throng of the party. The world seemed to tilt. The memory of my father's voice, what you build with your own hands, no one can ever take away from you, clashed violently with the image of my sister's laughing face. It wasn't just carelessness, it wasn't just an accident, it was contempt. It was a gleeful desecration of the one thing in my life that was sacred. And in that moment, sitting alone in my pristine apartment, the simmering resentment of a lifetime finally ignited into a cold, diamond-hard rage. The good girl was gone. My fingers were numb. I stared at the phone screen, at the frozen image of my sister laughing, while my father's legacy lay scorched at her feet. The shaking in my hands had stopped. A strange glacial calm was spreading through my veins, freezing the white-hot rage into something solid and heavy. I didn't have to think. For the first time in my life, there was no doubt, no hesitation, no voice in my head, telling me to be the bigger person. I found Chloe's contact and pressed the call button. The phone rang once, twice. On the third ring, she picked up, her voice a syrupy burst of energy. "Em, oh my God, I was just about to call you. Thank you for the cottage. It was absolutely perfect. We had the most amazing time." The lie was so effortless, so practiced. I said nothing, letting the silence hang in the air. "Em, are you there?" she asked, a flicker of uncertainty in her tone. "I saw the footage, Chloe," I said. My voice was flat, devoid of any emotion. It sounded like a stranger's. "Footage? What footage?" The fake cheerfulness was gone, replaced by a guarded defensiveness. "From the security camera," I stated simply. "The one you didn't know was there. I saw the party, all 20 of your guests." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Then the immediate pivot from defense to offense. "You put a camera up to spy on me?" Her voice rose, dripping with manufactured outrage. "What is wrong with you? That is so disgusting, Emily. That's a total invasion of privacy." I didn't take the bait. I didn't engage with the accusation. It was a smokescreen, and I walked right through it. "I'm talking about the damage, Chloe. The broken railing, the trash everywhere, the burn marks on the hardwood floor." I took a deliberate breath. "I'm talking about the cornerstone on the patio, the one you watched your friend destroy." A beat of silence, then a sound that cracked the last remaining filament of my restraint. A short, sharp laugh. It was a sound of pure dismissal. "Oh my God, Emily, is that what this is about?" she scoffed, her voice laced with incredulous pity. "It's just a bunch of rocks. You're being so dramatic. Things happen at parties. You of all people should try to have some fun for once. This isn't about fun, Chloe. This is about respect, about responsibility. Well, I'm sorry, but we're a little busy right now planning a wedding, she shot back, the word wedding weaponized to make my concerns seem trivial and small. We don't have time or money to worry about every little scratch. You're the one with the successful career. You fix it. And then, before I could respond, the line went dead. She had hung up on me. I slowly lowered the phone from my ear. The glacial calm within me had finally solidified. It was no longer just anger or hurt. It was clarity. She felt nothing. No remorse, no responsibility, no shame. In her world, I was not her sister. I was a resource. My home was a venue. My feelings were an inconvenience. And my father's memory was just a bunch of rocks. The fight wasn't over. It had just begun. The drive upstate the next morning was silent. The sun was bright, the sky a crisp, cloudless blue, but I saw none of it. My world had narrowed to the stretch of asphalt in front of me. The anger from the night before had cooled into a hard, dense resolve in the pit of my stomach. There was no more screaming in my head, just a quiet, methodical hum. I was a landscape architect about to survey a disaster site. I smelled it before I even got out of the car. The stale, sour stench of spilled beer and cigarette smoke hung in the clean country air, a flag of desecration planted on my property. The flimsy party lights were still tangled in the porch railing, drooping like sad, dead vines. A garbage bag, overstuffed and leaking a dark, sticky fluid, had been left by the door. I pushed the door open and the smell hit me full force. It was a college dorm room on a Sunday morning, a layer of filth and regret coating every surface. The hardwood floors were tacky under my shoes. Empty bottles and crushed cans littered the living room. Someone had taken a tube of bright red lipstick and drawn a crude smiley face on the antique mirror above the fireplace, a mirror that had belonged to my grandmother. I walked through the house with a clinical detachment, my mind a blank slate, my senses taking inventory. A cigarette burn on the arm of the sofa, a wine stain blossoming on the new area rug, sticky rings from cups on the wooden dining table. Each discovery was a small, sharp jab, but I registered them without flinching. This wasn't the time for pain. This was the time for accounting. Finally, I stepped out onto the patio, and that's when the detachment shattered. The sunlight hit the cracked cornerstone, illuminating the ugly, web-like fracture and the black scorch mark that radiated from it. The world went quiet. My breath hitched in my throat. This was different. This wasn't just mess or carelessness. This was a scar on a memory. I knelt down, my knees pressing into the cold, gritty stone. I didn't want to, but I had to. My fingers, trembling slightly, traced the sharp, raised edge of the crack. I could feel the ghost of my father's hand over mine, could hear his low voice explaining how the weight had to be distributed just so. He had called this stone the heart of the patio. It holds everything else together, Em. A single hot tear escaped and slid down my cheek, dropping onto the scorched stone where it sizzled and vanished. It was the only one I allowed myself. I took a deep, shuddering breath, pushed myself back to my feet, and pulled out my phone. The transformation was immediate. My hands steadied, my vision cleared. I was no longer a grieving daughter. I was a professional building a case. I started with a wide video, slowly panning across the entire chaotic scene, narrating the date and time in a low, steady voice. Then the detailed work began. I took photos of everything, The lipstick on the mirror, the burn on the sofa, the garbage, the stains. Each photo was a piece of evidence. Each click of the shutter was an act of defiance. I saved the patio for last. I took dozens of pictures from every conceivable angle. Close-ups of the crack, the scorch mark, the surrounding stones that had been chipped and stained. Then I started making calls. First, to a specialty cleaning crew that dealt with post-event disasters. Then to a furniture restorer, and finally to a master stonemason, an old artisan I'd worked with before, a man who understood the value of things built to last. I sent him the photos. He called me back a few minutes later, his voice gruff with disapproval. "This is a thermal fracture, Emily," he said. "A shock to the stone. It's not a simple repair. To do it right, to match the original work, you're looking at a significant cost." I sat on the porch steps, away from the worst of the mess, a legal pad on my lap, my pen scratching as I wrote down the numbers. The cleaning crew, the floor refinishing, the upholstery repair, the stonework. The numbers climbed, one after another, until they formed a tower of consequence. I drew a line at the bottom of the page and did the math. Then I did it again, just to be sure. The total stared back at me from the page, a stark, brutal figure in black ink. $15,450. I looked at the number, then at the wreckage of my beautiful, peaceful cottage. The pain was still there, a deep, resonant ache. But it was no longer just a wound. It now had a price tag. It had been quantified, documented, and transformed into a weapon. And I was going to use it. I was still sitting on the porch steps, the legal pad heavy in my lap, when my phone rang. The screen lit up with a picture of my mother, smiling brightly from a cruise ship deck a few years ago. My thumb hovered over the decline button. A part of me, the part that had been conditioned for 30 years, knew I should answer, knew that not answering would only make it worse. I took a breath and swiped to accept. I didn't even have a chance to say hello. "Emily, what on earth do you think you're doing?" The voice was sharp, accusatory. There was no warmth, no concern, just the brittle edge of irritation. "Hello to you too, Mom." The words came out colder than I intended. "Don't take that tone with me. Chloe just called me, absolutely hysterical. She's been crying for an hour. How could you be so cruel to her?" The accusation was so breathtakingly unjust that for a moment I couldn't speak. I was standing in the wreckage of my home, a home she had never once helped me paint or weed or fix, and I was the cruel one. "Cruel?" I finally managed, my voice dangerously quiet. "Did she happen to mention the party? Did she send you pictures of the lipstick on the mirror, the burn on the sofa, the $15,000 in damages?" "Oh, for heaven's sake, Emily, don't be so dramatic," she snapped. "It was a little party that got out of hand. Chloe feels terrible about it. You're trying to ruin her engagement, her one moment of happiness, over some spilled wine and a few broken things." "A few broken things?" I stood up, my own anger beginning to boil, breaking through the cold resolve. I walked back to the patio and stared down at the fractured stone. "Mom, they destroyed the patio, the one Dad and I built. They broke the cornerstone." I waited, a foolish, flickering hope that the mention of my father, of her late husband, would spark some flicker of understanding, of empathy. The response was a sigh of profound exasperation. "Emily, your father is gone. What good are a bunch of old stones going to do for anyone? You're living in the past. Chloe is trying to build a future." The words were like stones themselves, each one striking a blow. She wasn't just dismissing the damage, she was dismissing my grief, my memory, my father. The most important thing right now is your sister's wedding, she continued, her voice taking on a righteous, lecturing tone. She and Liam are under so much stress. The last thing they need is you waving a bill in their faces and making them feel guilty. You need to be the bigger person here. You need to show some grace, be forgiving, and let this go. That is what a family does. I stood there, phone pressed to my ear, listening to the chirping of the crickets in the long grass. The world around me felt impossibly vast and empty. She was right. That was what our family did. Chloe broke things, and I was expected to forgive. Chloe took, and I was expected to give. My pain was an inconvenience. My boundaries were selfish. My inheritance from my father wasn't a memory to be cherished, but a pile of rocks to be discarded for the sake of a wedding. She wasn't my ally. She wasn't even a neutral party. She was Chloe's shield, and I was just the enemy she was defending against. The last, desperate hope that I was not completely alone in this died a quiet, painful death. I have to go, Mom, I said, my voice flat and empty. I disconnected the call before she could reply and stared out at the garden, at the beautiful, broken world I had built by myself. And I knew with absolute certainty that I would have to save it by myself too. I didn't go home. After leaving the cottage, I drove straight to the city, to the downtown office of a lawyer my firm had on retainer. The building was old and smelled of leather and floor wax, a scent of stability and order that was the complete opposite of the chaos I had just left behind. Mr. Davies was a man in his late 60s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. He listened patiently without interruption as I laid out the story. I didn't cry, I didn't raise my voice, I simply presented the facts, my voice as steady as the hand of a surgeon. I placed the thick folder on his polished mahogany desk, the printed photos of the damage, the itemized list of quotes totaling over $15,000, a USB drive containing the security camera footage. He reviewed everything in silence, his expression unreadable. He put on his glasses to look at the photos, his lips tightening slightly at the image of the cracked cornerstone. He watched the video clip of the barbecue grill tipping over, then watched it again. When he was done, he took off his glasses and looked at me, his gaze direct and serious. "Your mother told you to let this go," he repeated, not as a question, but as a statement of fact I had relayed. "She said I should be the bigger person," I confirmed, my voice flat. He leaned back in his chair, the leather groaning softly. "Ms. Vance," he said, his voice calm and firm, "being the bigger person does not mean being a doormat. What has happened here is not a simple family squabble. This is significant property destruction. Based on this evidence," he tapped the folder, "you don't just have a complaint, you have an exceptionally strong case." The words landed in the quiet room with incredible weight. An exceptionally strong case. It was a lighthouse in the fog of my isolation. I wasn't being dramatic. I wasn't living in the past. I was a person whose property had been destroyed, and I had a right to seek restitution. For the first time in 2 days, I felt the ground beneath my feet solidify. I was sitting in my car in the parking garage an hour later, the lawyer's words echoing in my mind, when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You don't know me, but my name is Sarah. I was at the party at your cottage on Saturday. I feel awful about what happened. Your sister is telling everyone you're crazy and overreacting, but I know what I saw. I thought you should have this." Below the message was a video file. My heart began to pound, a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. My thumb trembled as I pressed play. The video was shaky, obviously filmed on a phone in the middle of a loud party. The bass from some unseen speaker was distorted and overwhelming. The camera focused on Chloe. She was leaning against the porch railing, a red cup in her hand, her face flushed from alcohol. She was talking loudly to a group of friends, her voice sharp and slurring slightly. "Seriously," Chloe was saying, gesturing vaguely toward the garden with her cup. "My sister acts like this place is a museum. Like, God forbid you actually live in it. She treats this garden like it's some kind of sacred treasure." She took a long drink, then laughed, a high, sharp sound that cut through the music. "Honestly, I just want to show her that a house is for having fun, not for worshiping. I kind of hope something breaks, just to piss her off, you know? To teach her a little lesson about what's really important in life." The video ended. I stared at the black screen of my phone. The world outside the car, the concrete pillars, the painted lines, the distant sound of traffic seemed to fall away. A cold, terrifying clarity washed over me, so pure and so absolute, it felt like ice water flooding my veins. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't carelessness. It wasn't a party that got out of hand. It was a lesson. An act of deliberate, malicious contempt. My pain had been the entire point. Any last lingering whisper of doubt, any shred of familial obligation that might have been holding me back, was vaporized in that moment. This was no longer about a broken stone. It was about an act of war. And my sister had just handed me the perfect weapon. The official letter from Mr. Davies's office was sent via registered mail the next day. It was a formal, dispassionate document detailing the extent of the damages and formally requesting full restitution to avoid legal proceedings. It was a final civil opportunity for Chloe to take responsibility, a chance I knew she wouldn't take. I was right. Her response didn't come in the form of a phone call or a letter from a lawyer. It came 2 days later, in a way that was uniquely, devastatingly Chloe. My phone started buzzing with notifications from friends I hadn't spoken to in months, texts asking, "Are you okay? And is this true?" I opened my social media app, my heart a cold stone in my chest, and there it was. A long, rambling post from my sister, accompanied by a professionally shot engagement photo of her and Liam, looking blissful and deeply in love. The post was a masterpiece of manipulation. "I'm heartbroken to have to write this," it began. "But my own sister, Emily, is trying to destroy the happiest time of my life." She wrote about her wonderful romantic weekend at my big, beautiful cottage. She wrote about a small get-together with a few friends. She conceded there had been some minor accidental damage, a few scratches that she and Liam had been more than willing to help fix. But she claimed I had used this as an excuse to unleash years of jealousy and bitterness upon her. She painted me as a cold, wealthy, and vindictive workaholic who had always resented her happiness. She twisted my grief for my father into a morbid obsession with old things. The $15,000 invoice was described as a made-up, ridiculously inflated number, designed to ruin them financially and sabotage the wedding. "All we want is to start our lives together," she concluded. "But we are now facing a cruel lawsuit from the one person who should have been my biggest supporter. Please send us your love and prayers as we navigate this painful time." The post was flooded with comments, hundreds of them. Sympathy poured in from our extended family, from my mother's friends, from people I barely knew. They called me cruel, jealous, petty, and heartless. Chloe was a victim, a beautiful bride-to-be bullied by her wicked older sister. Her lies were so convincing that for a dizzying moment, I almost believed them myself. My first instinct was to delete my account, to retreat into the silence she had always tried to force me into. Airing family business in public felt cheap, a violation of a code I had always lived by. But as I read the comments, as I saw her narrative solidifying into fact in the court of public opinion, I realized that my silence was her most powerful weapon. My dignity was being used to legitimize her lies. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, my weariness a physical weight on my shoulders. I was tired of fighting, but I was more tired of losing. I didn't write a long, emotional rebuttal. I didn't defend my character or attack hers. I simply wrote the truth. There has been a lot of misinformation shared about a private family matter that has now been made public, my post began. To clarify, my sister and her fiancé were lent my home for a private weekend. They instead threw a large party that resulted in over $15,000 in professionally assessed damages. I gave them an opportunity to resolve this privately. They declined. I didn't call her a liar. I didn't mention her hateful words caught on video. I just stated the facts, and then at the end of the post, I attached a single file. Not a picture of the lipstick on the mirror or the burn on the sofa. I attached one of the photos I had taken of the patio. It was a close-up, high-resolution shot, taken in the harsh morning light. It showed the cracked, scorched cornerstone in brutal detail. Surrounded by the filth of the party, it needed no caption. The image spoke for itself. I hit post and turned off my phone. The battle was no longer a private war of words. It was a public hearing, and I had just submitted my first piece of evidence. The months of waiting had condensed into this single, silent moment. The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined, paneled in dark wood that seemed to absorb both sound and light. It smelled of old paper and furniture polish, a scent of solemn, unyielding order. There was no jury, just a judge in black robes who sat elevated before us, his face a neutral mask. This wasn't a trial for television, it was a civil proceeding, a place where passions were meant to be distilled into facts. I sat beside Mr. Davies at our designated table, my back straight, my hands folded neatly over a single file folder. I had chosen my outfit with the care of a soldier preparing a uniform, a simple dark gray suit, a plain white blouse. My hair was pulled back. There was no room for emotion in my appearance, no plea for sympathy. I was there as a business owner whose property had been damaged. I was an asset, and this was a matter of accounting. Across the aisle, it was a different story. It was pure theater. Chloe sat beside her lawyer, looking small and fragile in a pale pink dress. She clutched a crumpled tissue in her hand, though I hadn't seen her shed a single tear. Her face was pale, her eyes downcast, a perfect portrait of a wronged innocent. My mother sat directly behind her, a black-clad sentinel of indignation. Her glare was a physical force, boring into the side of my head, but I refused to look at her. I would not give her the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. The judge called the room to order, his voice a dispassionate baritone that filled the heavy silence. "Mr. Davies, you may begin." My lawyer rose to his feet. He was not a dramatic man, and his strength was in his quiet confidence. He stood before the judge, calm and methodical, and began to lay out the case, brick by methodical brick. "Your Honor," he began, his voice even and clear, "this is not a complex case. It is a straightforward matter of property destruction and a refusal to accept responsibility." He didn't speak of sisters or families. He spoke of a property owner and a licensee. He didn't talk about hurt feelings or broken promises. He talked about a clear violation of a verbal agreement. He laid out the timeline from the initial request to the discovery of the damage, his narrative clean and stripped of all emotion. I kept my eyes fixed forward on the judge, but my senses were on high alert. I could feel the tension radiating from the other table. I could hear the soft, theatrical sniffle from Chloe. I could feel my mother's fury like a low-grade fever. This was it, the culmination of a lifetime of quiet sacrifices and swallowed injustices. But here, in this sterile room, the old rules didn't apply. My mother's disapproval had no legal standing. Chloe's tears were not evidence. Here, only the truth mattered, and I had brought it with me, documented in receipts and captured in high-resolution photographs. The battle had begun, and for the first time in my life, I felt I was standing on solid ground. Mr. Davies walked to a large monitor that had been set up facing the judge. Your Honor, the defendant, Ms. Chloe Vance, has repeatedly characterized the event at my client's home as a small get-together. I'd like to begin by showing the court a short clip from the home's exterior security camera, time-stamped 10:47 p.m. on the night in question. He clicked a key on his laptop, and the screen flickered to life. The silent courtroom was suddenly filled with the ghostly, silent images of chaos. My peaceful cottage porch, now teeming with strangers. The flashing lights, the plastic cups, the sheer number of people, laughing and shouting, their mouths moving without sound. It looked exactly like what it was, a full-blown, out-of-control party. The judge watched, his face impassive, but his eyes didn't move from the screen. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Chloe shrink in her chair, her performance of fragility momentarily forgotten. Next, Mr. Davies said, clicking to the next file, a series of photographs taken by my client the following morning. One by one, the images I had taken filled the screen. The crude lipstick smiley face on my grandmother's mirror, the dark, ugly cigarette burn on the sofa cushion, the sticky, stained floors. And then he brought up the photo, the close-up of the cracked cornerstone. The image was huge, brutal in its detail. The judge leaned forward slightly. "This patio, Your Honor," Mr. Davies said, his voice softening just a fraction, "was not built by contractors. It was built by my client and her late father by hand, the summer she was 16. This particular stone," he used a laser pointer to circle the fracture, "was what her father called the cornerstone. It was, for my client, not merely a piece of property. It was a memorial, a priceless and irreplaceable piece of her family's history." I felt a lump form in my throat, but I swallowed it down. I could feel my father's presence in that room, not as a ghost, but as a standard of integrity that my sister had failed to meet. The photo was more than evidence of damage. It was evidence of a desecrated memory. I could feel my mother's glare intensify, but now it felt weak, impotent against the stark reality on the screen. "Finally, Your Honor," Mr. Davies said, turning a page in his notes. "The defense has attempted to paint this as a matter of jealousy, suggesting my client is lashing out for personal reasons. I would like to call Miss Sarah Jenkins to the stand." A young woman with an honest, nervous face was sworn in. It was the girl from the text message. She sat in the witness box, twisting her hands in her lap. Mr. Davies approached her gently. "Ms. Jenkins, were you a guest at the party at Ms. Emily Vance's home?" "Yes, sir," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "And at that party, did you overhear the defendant, Ms. Chloe Vance, speaking about her sister and the cottage?" "Yes, sir." "Can you please tell the court, to the best of your recollection, what you heard Ms. Vance say?" Sarah took a deep breath. She was talking to some friends. She said her sister treated the place like a museum and that a house was for having fun, not worshipping. She paused, glancing nervously at Chloe, who was now staring at her with undisguised hatred. And then she said she hoped something would break, just to piss her sister off and teach her a lesson about what was really important. The words hung in the dead-still air of the courtroom. They were an echo of the video I had watched in the car, but hearing them spoken aloud, under oath, gave them a devastating new power. They were no longer just words, they were a confession of motive. I risked a glance at my sister. The mask of the victim had finally slipped. Her face was a storm of shock and fury. The truth, in all its ugly simplicity, had finally been brought into the light, and my hope, which had been a tiny, flickering flame, began to grow into a steady, confident glow. It was Chloe's turn to take the stand. Her lawyer guided her through a series of gentle questions, building a narrative of youthful indiscretion. She was a bride-to-be, he explained, overwhelmed and excited. The party was a mistake, a moment of poor judgment from a young woman who had never had to manage such responsibilities. When he asked about her refusal to pay for the damages, the real performance began. Chloe's eyes welled with tears. She dabbed at them with the tissue she'd been holding, her voice breaking as she spoke. "I was devastated when Emily told me the cost," she whispered, her words directed at the judge. We don't have that kind of money. We're just starting our lives. Every penny is going toward the wedding, toward our future." She looked so earnest, so genuinely distraught, that a murmur of sympathy rippled through the small gallery where my mother sat. Then it was Mr. Davies's turn. He rose and approached the witness box, his demeanor calm, almost gentle. "Ms. Vance," he began, "you've testified that you were horrified by the damage and simply lacked the funds to repair it. Is that correct?" "Yes," Chloe sniffled. "I felt terrible. I still do." "I see." Mr. Davies paused, then turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I would like to play a short video for the court. It was taken by a guest at the party, Ms. Sarah Jenkins, on the night of the incident." He clicked a key, and the monitor lit up. The shaky video filled the screen, and the sound of Chloe's sharp, slurring voice filled the silent courtroom. I kind of hope something breaks just to piss her off, to teach her a little lesson about what's really important in life. The silence that followed was absolute. It was so profound I could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. I watched Chloe's face. The color drained from it, leaving a pale, waxy mask of shock. The pretty, tearful bride had vanished, replaced by a venomous stranger. The judge's eyes, which had been on the screen, slowly moved to fix on my sister. He said nothing, but his expression was a verdict in itself. Mr. Davies let the silence hang for a long, punishing moment before he spoke again. "A lesson, Ms. Vance?" he asked quietly. "Was the destruction of your sister's property the lesson you intended to teach her?" Chloe stammered, speechless, her eyes wide with panic. I was drunk. I didn't mean it." Mr. Davies didn't press the point. He moved on, his voice still even. "Let's return to your claim of financial hardship. You stated that every penny is going toward your wedding." He placed a new document on the projector. It was a credit card statement. Chloe's name was clearly visible at the top. "Is this your statement?" Chloe nodded, her eyes darting nervously from the paper to her lawyer. "Could you please read for the court the charge dated 1 week after the party at my client's home, the one from Belle Aim Bridal Boutique?" Chloe stared at the document, her mouth opening and closing silently. "Allow me," Mr. Davies said, his voice cutting through the tension. A charge for $7,350. For a wedding dress, I presume? He didn't wait for an answer. And this charge, 2 days after that? Paradise Travel Agency, $3,000. Would that be the deposit for your honeymoon in Bali? The numbers landed like hammer blows in the quiet room. $7,000 for a dress, $3,000 for a vacation. All spent in the days immediately following her claim that she had no money to fix the damage she had caused. Chloe was no longer looking at the judge. She was staring at the floor, her face a blotchy, ugly red. The tissue lay shredded in her lap. Mr. Davies took a step closer, his voice dropping, forcing everyone to lean in. It was no longer a cross-examination. It was a eulogy for my sister's character. So, Ms. Vance, it seems the issue was never that you didn't have the money. He paused, letting the truth of it settle over the room. The issue was a matter of priority. A $7,000 dress you will wear once, and a trip to Bali were more important to you than taking responsibility for destroying a piece of your father's legacy and repaying the sister who gave you a place to stay. He looked from Chloe to the judge. Is that correct? There was no answer. There couldn't be. The mask hadn't just been slipped off, it had been atomized. For the first time, everyone in that room saw my sister not as I had been forced to see her, but as she truly was. And in that moment, I felt no joy, no triumph, just a profound tectonic shift inside me. The weight of a lifetime of injustice had finally been lifted, and in its place, there was only the quiet, clean, and undeniable light of the truth. The judge took off his reading glasses and set them down deliberately on the stack of papers before him. He surveyed the room, his gaze resting for a moment on Chloe's stricken face, then on mine before he finally spoke. The silence in the room was no longer tense, it was heavy with finality. After reviewing all the evidence presented, he began, his voice a calm, neutral instrument of law. It is clear to this court that the damage to the plaintiff's property was not only a direct result of the defendant's actions, but was exacerbated by a profound lack of responsibility. He picked up a piece of paper, the official judgment. Therefore, the court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Ms. Emily Vance. A choked, gasping sound came from the other table, like air being punched from lungs. I didn't turn to look. I kept my eyes fixed on the judge, my entire being focused on his next words. The defendant, Ms. Chloe Vance, is found fully liable and is hereby ordered to pay restitution for the full amount of $15,450 to cover all repairs. He paused, then added the final crushing blow. In addition, the defendant will be responsible for all associated legal fees incurred by the plaintiff in this matter. The gasp from across the aisle turned into a ragged sob. It wasn't a sound of remorse, it was the raw animal sound of consequence. I heard a rustle of fabric and a sharp whisper from my mother. "Chloe, stop it, not here." But the dam had broken. The carefully constructed mask of the victim dissolved into the raw, ugly face of defeat. The perfect family, the successful daughter, the beautiful bride-to-be. It all evaporated under the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom. I didn't feel a rush of victory. There was no triumphant surge, no desire to pump my fist in the air. It was more like a long, slow exhale I hadn't realized I'd been holding for months, or maybe years. A heavy, suffocating weight had been lifted, but its absence left a strange and hollow quiet. Justice didn't feel like a celebration. It felt like a balancing of the scales, a necessary but somber accounting. Mr. Davies placed a hand lightly on my arm. "Congratulations, Emily," he said softly. "Thank you," I murmured, my voice thick. "Thank you for everything." I stood, my movements measured and calm. I gathered my single folder from the table, and without a backward glance at the wreckage of my sister and my mother, I walked toward the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom. I didn't need to see their ruin. I had lived in its shadow my entire life. All I needed was the freedom of walking away. And as the door clicked shut behind me, closing the final chapter of that life, I felt the first tentative rays of it. I didn't hear from them for a few months. The silence was a balm, a quiet, fertile space where I could begin to heal. The court had set up a payment plan, and every 2 weeks a small anonymous deposit would appear in my bank account. It was a sterile, impersonal transaction, a constant reminder that justice, in the end, is a form of bookkeeping. The rest of the story came to me in fragments through the quiet hum of the family grapevine. A well-meaning aunt called, her voice laced with pity, to tell me the wedding was off. Liam, it turned out, was a man who valued a stable balance sheet above all else. A fiancé with a 5-figure debt, a public reputation for dishonesty, and a demonstrated allergy to responsibility was, in his words, a poor investment. He had quietly extricated himself a week after the verdict, leaving Chloe not at the altar, but in the wreckage she had created. Then a cousin sent me a text. She'd been in a department store downtown and had seen Chloe. She wasn't shopping, she was working, folding a pile of cashmere sweaters. With a sullen, unfamiliar slowness, the designer handbag was gone, replaced by a cheap, store-issued apron. A few weeks after that, someone else mentioned seeing her behind the counter at a Starbucks during the morning rush. Her perfect manicure replaced by stained, hurried fingers as she fumbled with a hot coffee sleeve. I felt no pleasure in these images, no satisfying sting of revenge. I just felt a quiet sense of order, a natural law, like gravity, finally asserting itself. For her entire life, Chloe had lived on credit, both financial and emotional, and I had always been the one to pay the bill. Now, for the first time, she was learning the true cost of a cup of coffee, of a cashmere sweater, of the life she had always taken for granted. She was learning the value of $1 because, for the first time, she was having to earn one. My mother called once, about 2 months after the trial. Her voice was thin, stripped of its usual authority. She didn't apologize. She didn't admit any fault. She just talked about how hard it was for Chloe, how tired she was, how it wasn't fair that her life had been ruined over a silly mistake. She was testing the waters, looking for the old, familiar crack in my resolve where her guilt could seep in. I listened patiently, without interruption, until she had exhausted herself. The old Emily would have softened, would have offered to help, would have shouldered the burden that was never mine to carry. But that Emily was gone. "I have to go, Mom," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "I wish you both well." I didn't hang up angry. I didn't raise my voice. I simply ended the conversation. The invisible chain that had bound me to their drama for 30 years had been broken. It wasn't my job to fix them anymore. It wasn't my job to forgive them. My only job was to tend to my own garden. And for the first time, there were no weeds. It was spring when I finally returned to the cottage for good. The air was soft and carried the scent of damp earth and new beginnings. The cleaning crews and restorers had long since finished their work, but I had needed time. Time for the silence to feel like peace instead of emptiness. The house was clean, the ugly lipstick smile wiped from my grandmother's mirror. The cigarette burn on the sofa, mended so skillfully, You would never know it had been there. But I walked straight through the back door, out into the sunlight. And there it was, my patio. The old artisan, a man with hands as gnarled and wise as an oak tree, had done more than just repair it. He had honored it. He'd found a piece of stone from the same local quarry as the original, its color and texture a near-perfect match. The new cornerstone was seamless, the surface smooth and solid under my feet. The scar was gone. The memory remained. I spent the afternoon on my knees, not in prayer, but in communion with the soil. My hands, gloved and purposeful, worked the earth, clearing away the last of the winter debris. I had brought something with me, a small dormant rose bush, a variety my father had always loved for its deep, velvety red petals and its stubborn resilience through the harshest winters. I dug a hole, my movements practiced and sure, and settled the roots into their new home, tamping the soil around them like a blanket. Later, cleaning out a dusty corner of the old garden shed, my fingers brushed against a forgotten metal box. Inside, tucked between old seed packets and a rusty trowel, was a photograph. The edges were curled and faded, but the image was as clear as yesterday. It was me at 16, grinning at the camera, a smudge of cement on my cheek. My father stood beside me, his arms slung around my shoulders, his face tired but beaming with a pride so profound it radiated from the glossy paper. We were standing on the half-finished patio, two builders admiring their creation. I sank down onto the shed steps, the photograph held gently in my hands. A smile spread across my face, slow and real and effortless. It wasn't a smile of victory or of vindication. It was a smile of pure, quiet peace. My father had been wrong in one way and right in another. Someone could try to take away what you built with your own hands. They could scratch it and scorch it and try to teach you a lesson in contempt. But they could never take away the strength you built into yourself while you were making it. They could never take away the love. I went back outside and placed the small faded photograph on the little bistro table beside the patio door, propping it against a terracotta pot. It wasn't a memorial to a past that had been desecrated. It was a quiet testament to a foundation that had held. Then I picked up my trowel, knelt down, and got back to work, my hands sinking into the rich, dark soil of my own garden. The sun was warm on my back, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt completely and utterly free.